They say time heals all wounds, but that is a lie. A comfortable fiction peddled by those who have never truly lost everything. For me, time was not a healer. It was a whetstone. Every passing year, every hard-won victory, every solitary night spent staring at unfamiliar ceilings only sharpened the edge of my resolve, honing it into something cold, precise, and utterly unyielding. The wound festered, yes, but it also became a source of incredible strength, a constant, burning reminder of what was stolen and what I was destined to reclaim. The world believed I was gone, vanished into the footnotes of a grand family history, a discarded branch on a magnificent ancient tree. They were sorely mistaken. I was merely waiting, observing, learning. And now, after decades spent in the shadows, meticulously crafting my return, the waiting is finally over. The stage is set. I remember the scent of the rose garden at dawn, a tapestry woven from dew-kissed petals and rich, damp earth. Lackwood Manor, my ancestral home, was more than just a house. It was a living, breathing entity, its stone walls echoing with centuries of laughter, whispered secrets, and the clinking of crystal glasses. My earliest memories are painted in the golden light of its vast libraries, the hushed grandeur of its drawing rooms, and the exhilarating thrill of exploring its sprawling grounds. I was a child of Blackwood, born into its legacy, bathed in its history, destined to carry its name forward. My father, a man of quiet strength and profound integrity, often walked with me through those gardens, his hand resting gently on my shoulder, pointing out the ancient oak that had stood sentinel for 500 years, or telling me tales of our forebears, their triumphs, and their follies. He instilled in me a deep reverence for our heritage, a sense of stewardship, a belief that the Blackwood name was not merely a title, but a sacred trust. My mother, a woman of ethereal beauty and sharp intellect, filled the manor with music and art. She encouraged my curiosity, nurtured my love for stories, and taught me the intricate dance of social graces that came with our station. We were a family unit, seemingly unbreakable, a perfect tableau of privilege and purpose. My older brother Arthur, though often distant and preoccupied with his own affairs, was still family. We shared the same blood, the same roots. Or so I thought. Our childhood was one of boundless opportunity, education from the finest tutors, travels to exotic lands, and the constant, comforting presence of a sprawling estate that felt like the very heart of the world. I roamed the ancient woods, built forts by the winding river, and imagined myself a knight defending his castle, never once dreaming that the greatest threat to my kingdom would come from within its very walls. The first tremor of unease, a barely perceptible crack in the perfect facade, began subtly, insidious as a creeping vine. It started with Arthur. He was always driven, ambitious to a fault, but as he grew older, his ambition curdled into something colder, more calculating. He began to spend more time with our uncle, Silas, a man my father always regarded with a certain wary tolerance. Silas was a distant relative, a second cousin twice removed, a man whose charm was as polished as it was superficial, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. He possessed a shrewd, opportunistic mind and a talent for ingratiating himself with those in power. My father, with his old-world honor, found Silas's methods distasteful, but tolerated him for the sake of family peace. Arthur, however, seemed to fall under Silas's spell, drawn to his cunning and his disregard for conventional morality. I saw the change in my brother, a hardening in his gaze, a growing impatience with anything that did not directly serve his own advancement. Our conversations grew strained, replaced by a subtle rivalry that I, in my naive youth, could not fully comprehend. Then came the illness. My father, robust and vital one day, was suddenly felled by a mysterious ailment that baffled the finest doctors. It was a rapid decline, a cruel, swift taking. The manor, once vibrant, became cloaked in a heavy pall of grief. My mother, devastated, retreated into herself, her spirit dimmed beyond recognition. In the midst of this profound sorrow, Arthur, guided by Silas, stepped into the void. He began to make decisions, ostensibly to ease my mother's burden, but I sensed a shift in the power dynamics, a quiet seizing of control. I was too young, too consumed by my own grief, to truly fight back, to see the intricate web being spun around us. I trusted my brother, believed in the sanctity of family. That was my first, most grievous mistake. The day of my father's funeral is etched in my memory with the clarity of a newly cut diamond, cold and sharp. The air was thick, with the scent of lilies and unspoken tension. After the somber ceremony, as the last of the mourners departed, Arthur called for a family meeting in my father's study, a room that now felt hollow and alien without his presence. My mother, still frail and weeping, sat beside me, her hand clutching mine. Silas stood beside Arthur, a predatory glint in his eyes. What followed was a carefully orchestrated performance, a masterpiece of deception. Arthur, his voice laced with a feigned sorrow that made my skin crawl, spoke of my father's final wishes, of the immense responsibilities that now fell upon him as the eldest son. He presented documents, meticulously prepared, ostensibly signed by my father in his dying days, outlining a revised will. According to these papers, my father had, in a moment of supposed clarity and concern for the family's future, decided to consolidate the entire Blackwood estate, its vast holdings, and considerable wealth, solely under Arthur's stewardship. My own inheritance, my birthright, the very legacy I was, the final, devastating blow. The personal letters, the diary entries, the raw, emotional truth of Arthur's betrayal, held in her frail hands, would transform him from a mere corporate villain into a monster in the public eye. They would make his crimes not just illegal, but unforgivable. The time for subtlety was drawing to a close. The stage was set, the audience was engaged, and the main act was about to begin. We had gathered the financial evidence, the legal frameworks, the public narrative. All that remained was to deliver the coup de grace, the human element that would make Arthur's downfall absolute and irreversible. It was a story that only my mother could tell, a truth that only she could unveil. The delicate and volatile piece of the puzzle was ready to be placed, and when it landed, it would shatter Arthur's world beyond repair. I looked at the image of Arthur on a news channel, his face a mask of controlled anger, and felt no joy, only a cold, stark satisfaction. Justice, long denied, was finally within reach. The days leading up to the final act were a blur of hushed conversations, legal consultations, and an almost unbearable tension. My mother, fragile as spun glass, yet possessing an inner steel I had only recently come to fully appreciate, prepared herself for the public unveiling. We had chosen a path that bypassed the slower, more formal court proceedings for this particular revelation. The goal was not just legal conviction, but utter public repudiation, a moral bankruptcy that would strip Arthur of his carefully constructed facade and leave him exposed. A special broadcast, an investigative journalism piece of the highest caliber, had been arranged. It offered the platform, the reach, and the gravitas required. I spent countless hours with her, rehearsing not the words themselves, for those were hers alone, but the delivery. I reminded her to breathe, to look into the camera not as an enemy but as a friend, a conduit to the millions who needed to hear her truth. We reviewed the letters, tracing Arthur's elegant, deceptive script, the diary entries where her youthful hopes had been so meticulously recorded, only to be systematically crushed. Each reading was a fresh wound, but with each repetition, a new layer of resolve seemed to harden within her. She was no longer just a victim. She was a witness, an accuser, and a survivor. The morning of the broadcast, a strange quiet descended upon our small apartment. The city outside hummed with its usual indifferent rhythm, but inside, time seemed to stand still. My mother wore a simple, elegant dress, chosen to convey dignity and sincerity. Her hair, usually a soft silver cloud, was neatly styled. She looked frail, yes, but also immensely strong, like an ancient oak that had weathered 1,000 storms. She clutched a small, worn leather-bound book, her diary, and a sheaf of aged letters tied with a delicate silk ribbon. These were her weapons, more potent than any legal brief. As we drove to the studio, the car ride was silent. My hand found hers, and I squeezed it gently. Her skin was cool, her grip surprisingly firm. She met my gaze, and in her eyes I saw a flicker of fear, quickly replaced by an unyielding determination. This was not just for her. It was for all the others, for the principle of truth, for the justice that had been so cruelly withheld from our family for decades. The studio was a cavernous space, filled with lights, cameras, and a small, hushed crew. The air crackled with anticipation. I was relegated to a monitor room, watching her from behind a pane of glass, a silent guardian. The interviewer, a renowned journalist known for her incisive yet compassionate style, greeted my mother warmly. The stage was set, the final curtain preparing to rise on Arthur's long, ignominious performance. When the red light on the camera illuminated, signaling they were live, my breath hitched. My mother took a deep, steadying breath. Her voice, initially a little tremulous, soon found its strength, filling the studio, reaching out through the airwaves into countless homes. She began by recounting the early days, the whirlwind romance, the promises, the grand vision Arthur had painted for their future. Her words were simple, unadorned, but imbued with an authenticity that transcended mere facts. She spoke of the trust she had placed in him, the dreams they had shared, the innocent belief in a love that was supposed to last forever. Then she began to read. Her fingers, trembling slightly, untied the ribbon, and she held up the first letter, its paper yellowed with age. She paraphrased its contents, her voice now imbued with a quiet pain. It was a letter from Arthur, written in the early days of their marriage, filled with declarations of undying love, promises of a shared future, assurances of his devotion and commitment to their fledgling company. She then contrasted it with a later letter, one written years later, when his ambition had begun to curdle into something cold and calculating. This one, she explained, spoke of business exigencies, of necessary sacrifices, framing his growing distance and eventual appropriation of her inheritance as a shared burden, a temporary measure for the greater good of their enterprise. The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the subtle tremor of her lip, the unshed tears in her eyes. She did not weep openly. Her dignity held strong. She simply told her story, letting the stark contrast between the loving words and the subsequent actions speak for themselves. She described how he had slowly, meticulously isolated her, chipping away at her confidence, making her doubt her own judgment, until she was entirely dependent on him, not just financially, but emotionally. She recounted the conversations where he had persuaded her to sign away her family's assets, promising to reinvest them, to build an empire for them both, all while secretly diverting funds, establishing shell corporations, and systematically erasing her contribution. Then came the diary. She opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, yet it carried immense power. She read entries describing her growing unease, her attempts to confront him, his gaslighting, his dismissals of her concerns as feminine hysteria, or lack of business acumen. The entries detailed the slow, agonizing realization that the man she loved, the father of my brother, was systematically dismantling her life, stealing her legacy, and betraying her trust in the most profound way imaginable. She spoke of the heartbreak, the humiliation, the feeling of utter helplessness that had consumed her. She spoke of my brother, how Arthur had used his love for his son as leverage, threatening to cut them off, to ruin their lives if she dared to challenge him. A collective gasp went through the control room. The raw, unvarnished truth, stripped of legal jargon, presented with the emotional weight of a lifetime of suppressed pain, was devastating. This was not just a financial crime. It was a crime of the heart, a violation of the deepest human bonds. The interviewer, her own face etched with empathy, asked gentle, probing questions, allowing my mother to elaborate, to fill in the painful gaps. My mother spoke of the years of silence, the shame, the fear that had kept her quiet, and the courage she had finally found, fueled by the desire for justice, not just for herself, but for her children, for the truth to finally see the light. I watched, my own eyes blurring, a knot of emotion tightening in my chest. This was it. This was the moment. The corporate fraud, the market manipulation, the illicit dealings, all of it now had a human face, a human cost. Arthur was no longer just a distant, calculating figure. He was the man who had systematically destroyed a woman's life, stolen her inheritance, and broken her heart. He was a monster, not just in the abstract, but in the most intimate, personal sense. As the broadcast neared its end, my mother looked directly into the camera, her gaze unwavering. She spoke of the importance of holding powerful men accountable, not just for their public transgressions, but for the private cruelties they inflicted. She spoke of the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of truth. When the red light finally went out, a profound silence fell. Then, the crew erupted in applause, some with tears in their eyes. The interviewer hugged my mother tightly, whispering words of admiration and gratitude. Back in the monitor room, I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and exhaustion. The air seemed lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from my shoulders, from our collective family's shoulders. But there was also a hollowness, a vast emptiness that opened up now that the years of relentless pursuit had reached their climax. The aftermath was immediate and ferocious. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, social media exploded. Arthur's carefully cultivated image as a shrewd, visionary leader shattered into a million pieces. The headlines screamed betrayal, fraud, and emotional abuse. News channels replayed excerpts of my mother's testimony, dissecting every word, every nuance. Legal experts weighed in, predicting the inevitable collapse of his empire, not just from the financial evidence we had amassed, but from the sheer force of public opinion, which had now turned irrevocably against him. His PR team, usually so adept at damage control, was helpless. There was no spin that could mitigate the raw, personal nature of my mother's story. Arthur issued a terse statement through his lawyers, dismissing my mother's claims as baseless, the ramblings of a disgruntled ex-wife seeking revenge. But the words rang hollow, an obvious attempt to deflect from the undeniable truth presented by her aged letters and diary entries. His controlled anger, which I had seen on the news channel, must have given way to a desperate fury. The following days were a whirlwind. Our legal team, bolstered by the public outcry, moved swiftly. The financial evidence, which had been building for months, now had the moral imperative behind it. Investors, already wary of his previous shady dealings, began pulling out en masse. His board of directors, facing shareholder revolt and unprecedented public pressure, initiated an emergency meeting. Calls for his immediate resignation, his arrest, and a full-scale investigation into his entire career became deafening. I watched it all unfold from a distance, feeling a strange detachment. The initial cold, stark satisfaction had given way to a more complex array of emotions. There was relief, certainly, a deep, cleansing sense that justice was indeed being served. But there was also a profound sadness for the years lost, the innocence shattered, the family fractured. My mother, though exhausted, seemed to visibly lighten, as if a decades-long weight had been lifted from her soul. She received an outpouring of support, letters and messages from strangers who had been touched by her bravery, by her story. It was a small balm for her wounds, a validation of her truth. Arthur's downfall was swift and brutal. The board forced his resignation, his assets were frozen, and multiple lawsuits, both civil and criminal, were launched. The public, once enamored by his charisma and success, now saw him for what he truly was, a ruthless, manipulative man who had built his empire on the backs of others, starting with his own wife. He became a pariah, his name synonymous with betrayal. I saw a recent image of him, caught by a paparazzi camera, as he left his former corporate headquarters, now besieged by reporters. He looked gaunt, his face pale and drawn, his eyes hollow. The controlled anger was gone, replaced by a defeated despair. He was no longer the imposing figure of power and influence. He was just an old man, stripped of everything he had valued. In that moment, I felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction, only a quiet, desolate sense of completion. The cycle of vengeance, or rather justice, was complete. The path to this moment had consumed my life for years. Every decision, every waking thought, had been directed towards this singular goal. Now that it was achieved, a vast, open expanse stretched before me. What did one do after such a monumental undertaking? The drive for retribution had been a powerful engine, but it was now spent. My mother began to heal, slowly, tentatively. She started painting again, a hobby she had abandoned decades ago. Her canvases, once filled with muted tones, now burst with vibrant colors, reflecting a newfound zest for life. She spoke of finding peace, of finally being able to look forward instead of constantly glancing back at the shadows of the past. Her bravery had not only brought Arthur down, but had also freed herself. For me, the future was less clear. The relentless pursuit of Arthur had defined my adult life. It had shaped my career choices, my relationships, my very identity. Now, I felt a strange sense of liberation, but also a disorienting aimlessness. The adrenaline, the focus, the strategic thinking, it all had to find a new purpose. I began to consider what truly mattered beyond the confines of this long battle. Perhaps it was time to build rather than dismantle, to create rather than destroy. The fight for justice had been a necessary, albeit painful, journey. It had taught me about resilience, about the insidious nature of power, and about the enduring strength of a mother's love and a daughter's devotion. Arthur's world had shattered, just as we had intended. The delicate and volatile piece of the puzzle had landed, and its impact was absolute and irreversible. Justice, long denied, had finally found its voice, and in doing so had paved the way, however uncertainly, for a new beginning. The cold satisfaction had thawed, revealing not joy but a quiet, profound sense of peace. The story was told, the truth unveiled, and the long, arduous chapter of retribution was finally closed. The quiet, profound sense of peace was not an immediate, overwhelming wave, but rather a slow, deliberate tide that washed over the desolate shores of my being. It seeped into the cracks that the battle had left, filling them not with exuberance, but with a steadying calm. The adrenaline, once a constant companion, now felt like a phantom limb, an echo of a state of heightened alert that was no longer necessary. The days that followed Arthur's conclusive fall were marked by an almost unsettling stillness. The phone, once a conduit for urgent messages and clandestine updates, lay silent. The frantic rhythm of my life had abruptly ceased, leaving behind a void that initially felt like a loss, not a gain. I found myself drifting through the hours, performing mundane tasks with a new, almost meditative focus. Brewing coffee, tending to the small, neglected garden outside my window, reading books that had gathered dust for years. Each action was an anchor, pulling me back to a reality that was simpler, less fraught with peril. It was a strange kind of freedom, one that required relearning how to simply exist, without the constant pressure of a mission. The world, once viewed through the narrow lens of strategy and impending conflict, now unfurled in a myriad of details I had long ignored. The way the light fell on the old wooden floor, the scent of rain on dry earth, the distant sound of children playing, these small observations began to fill the emptiness, not with grand purpose, but with gentle presence. My daughter, too, navigated this new landscape with a quiet grace. Her eyes, once shadowed with worry and a fierce determination, held a softer light now. We spent hours in comfortable silence, sometimes side by side, sometimes in separate rooms, simply existing in each other's orbit. There was a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the crucible we had passed through. Her healing was her own journey, but it intertwined with mine, a delicate tapestry of shared trauma and emerging hope. We spoke less of the past and more of the present, of small plans for the future, a trip to the coast, a new recipe to try, the simple joy of a shared meal. Her resilience had always been a marvel, and now it transformed into a quiet strength that promised a beautiful unfolding. She was no longer just the daughter whose justice I sought. She was a young woman finding her own voice, her own path, in a world that was now, finally, truly safe for her. The desire to build, rather than dismantle, began as a faint whisper, a tentative thought in the quiet corners of my mind. What did it mean to build? After a lifetime of deconstruction, my expertise had been in uncovering rot, in exposing corruption, in dismantling the carefully constructed facades of power. To build seemed an entirely different skill set, one I was unsure I possessed. Yet the conviction grew, a slow burn that warmed the core of my being. It wasn't about constructing physical structures, I realized, but about building systems, fostering connections, nurturing growth, where once there had been decay. I started small, as one must. I revisited old contacts, not for information or leverage, but for conversations about what was broken, what was needed. I found myself drawn to stories of resilience, of communities struggling to rebuild after their own forms of destruction. My mind, still sharp from years of strategic thinking, began to reframe problems. Instead of seeking vulnerabilities to exploit, I sought strengths to reinforce. Instead of identifying points of failure, I looked for points of connection. The scars of the battle remained, of course. They were etched not just into my memory but into the very fabric of my being. There were nights when the echoes of the past would resurface, vivid and unsettling. The faces of those we had fought, the moments of stark danger, the cold calculation required to bring a titan like Arthur to his knees. These experiences had left an indelible mark. I carried a new kind of vigilance, a heightened awareness of the subtle shifts in power dynamics, the insidious ways corruption could still fester, even in seemingly clean environments. But this vigilance was no longer fueled by a desperate need for retribution. It was tempered by a desire to protect, to prevent, to nurture. I found myself returning to the foundational principles that had guided me, even in the darkest hours. The belief in justice, yes, but also in empathy, in the inherent dignity of every individual. Arthur's world had been built on a foundation of exploitation and disregard for human life. My new purpose, I understood, must be built on the very opposite. It was about empowering the voiceless, about creating structures that supported genuine accountability, about fostering transparency not as a weapon, but as a safeguard. The transition was not without its awkwardness. My previous life had been one of shadows and calculated risks. Now I sought the light, the open dialogue, the collaborative effort. I had to learn to trust again, not just in my own judgment, but in the collective wisdom of others. It was a humbling process, shedding the cloak of solitary warrior for the more exposed, vulnerable role of a builder. I began to explore avenues where my unique understanding of systemic vulnerability could be applied constructively. The legal system, though imperfect, was a starting point. Not as a prosecutor, but as an advocate for reform, for mechanisms that could prevent the rise of another Arthur. I engaged with organizations dedicated to corporate governance, to ethical leadership, to safeguarding human rights. My insights, honed in the brutal arena of actual combat, proved surprisingly valuable. I could speak not just of theory, but of the stark human cost of unchecked power. There was a particular satisfaction in seeing the theoretical principles of justice translated into tangible, preventative measures. It was a slow, often frustrating process, filled with bureaucratic hurdles and entrenched resistance, but it was a different kind of fight. This one was fought with arguments, with data, with persuasion, not with subterfuge and confrontation. It was a battle for hearts and minds, for the very definitions of right and wrong within institutions. My daughter, observing my renewed engagement with the world, began to find her own direction. She pursued studies in social justice, her experiences having instilled in her a profound understanding of its necessity. We spoke of her coursework, of the theories she was learning, and I offered the grounding of practical experience, of the real-world implications of those concepts. Our conversations became richer, deeper, forging a new bond based on shared values and a common vision for a better future, rather than a shared burden of the past. Her passion, unburdened by the weight of personal vengeance, was pure and invigorating. It reminded me that the fight was never truly over, but that its nature could evolve, could become a force for creation rather than merely correction. The quiet peace I had found was not a cessation of effort, but a redirection of energy. It was the peace of purpose, a purpose that felt more expansive, more enduring, than the singular goal of retribution. The world was still complex, still rife with challenges, but I approached them with a different spirit. The cold satisfaction of victory had indeed thawed, revealing not joy, but a profound sense of responsibility, a commitment to nurture the seeds of justice and compassion wherever they might take root. I was building, one small step at a time, not just a new life for myself and my daughter, but contributing, in my own way, to a world where the insidious nature of power might one day be truly tamed, replaced by something far more resilient, far more human. The chapter of retribution was closed, yes, but the story of building, of creating, had just begun. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt truly, deeply alive, not as a weapon, but as an architect. The shift in my daily rhythm was profound. The early morning hours, once dedicated to planning and surveillance, now found me engaged in research, reading reports, drafting proposals for ethical frameworks that could prevent future abuses. My mind, once a labyrinth of strategic calculations, now focused on the architecture of sustainable change. I learned about restorative justice, about community-led initiatives, about the delicate art of consensus building. These were skills I had never prioritized, yet they felt like the natural extension of everything I had learned about the destructive power of unchecked authority. I began to attend conferences, not as an anonymous observer, but as a participant, sometimes even a speaker. I shared my experiences, carefully anonymized, of course, but imbued with the raw truth of what happens when systems fail and power corrupts. My voice, once used for subtle manipulation or urgent warnings, now carried the weight of earned wisdom, a testament to the devastating consequences of inaction. It was a strange sensation to stand before an audience, no longer hiding in the shadows, but openly advocating for change. The vulnerability was palpable, but so was the conviction. One particular project began to consume much of my attention. It involved working with a small, international nonprofit focused on strengthening legal frameworks in developing nations, specifically targeting corruption within resource extraction industries. This felt like a direct echo of Arthur's Empire, but approached from the opposite direction. Instead of tearing down an existing corrupt structure, we were working to build robust, transparent ones from the ground up, designed to be resilient against future attempts at exploitation. It was meticulous, often frustrating work, dealing with complex legal systems and deeply entrenched cultural practices. But every small victory, every piece of legislation drafted, every training session conducted, felt like a brick laid in a new, more equitable foundation. The people I worked with were different from my previous allies. They were lawyers, activists, academics, all driven by a shared idealism, but also by a pragmatic understanding of the long, slow work required for systemic change. There was a camaraderie born not of shared danger, but of shared purpose. We debated, we strategized, we celebrated small successes. I found myself learning as much as I contributed, my sharp edges slowly softening in the collaborative environment. My relationship with my daughter continued to deepen. She had started an internship with a local organization that provided legal aid to marginalized communities. Her stories from the field were heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. She spoke of individuals whose lives had been shattered by systemic inequities and of the profound impact of even small acts of legal intervention. Her empathy was boundless, and her commitment unwavering. She was, in many ways, carrying the torch, but illuminating a path of constructive engagement rather than destructive confrontation. We often discussed the nature of justice over dinner. She saw it as an ongoing process, a constant striving for fairness and equality. I, having seen its brutal absence and its hard-won restoration, viewed it as both an ideal and a fragile construct, requiring constant vigilance and diligent maintenance. Our perspectives complemented each other, bridging the gap between idealism and pragmatism. She reminded me of the purity of the cause, and I reminded her of the cunning of its adversaries. The quiet peace was not static. It was a dynamic state, constantly evolving, shaped by the new challenges and opportunities that arose. The ghosts of the past still lingered, but they no longer haunted me. They served as reminders, as lessons learned, as fuel for the new fire of creation. The cold satisfaction of retribution had indeed thawed, revealing not joy, for true joy felt too frivolous after such a journey, but a profound and abiding sense of purpose. It was a purpose rooted in the understanding that dismantling was sometimes necessary, but building was always essential. I often thought of Arthur's shattered world, the void he left behind. It was a void that others perhaps sought to fill with their own ambitions. But my focus had shifted. I was no longer concerned with the machinations of power-hungry individuals. My gaze was fixed on the architecture of a better future, on creating resilient systems that could withstand such assaults. The story of retribution was closed, yes, but the narrative of resilience, of reconstruction, of enduring human dignity, was being written, one careful, deliberate stroke at a time. And in that ongoing act of creation, I found a deeper, more sustainable form of peace than I had ever imagined possible. The days stretched into weeks, then months, each one a testament to the quiet revolution within me. The adrenaline withdrawals had long passed, replaced by a steady flow of energy directed towards constructive ends. My former life, the one consumed by the pursuit of Arthur, felt like a distant, intense dream. The skills I had honed in that crucible, the analytical mind, the strategic foresight, the unwavering determination, were not discarded, but repurposed. They were now tools for building, for safeguarding, for nurturing. I began to appreciate the subtle victories, the small shifts in policy, the successful training of local legal professionals, the creation of a new, transparent oversight committee. These were not the explosive, dramatic triumphs of my past, but they were deeply satisfying in their own way. They represented the slow, steady progress of a ship righting itself, of a foundation being laid, stone by careful stone. My physical surroundings also began to reflect this internal shift. The sparse, utilitarian apartment I had maintained during my active years gradually softened. I acquired more books, not just on law and strategy, but on history, philosophy, art. I cultivated a small indoor garden, finding a quiet joy in the act of tending to living things, watching them grow. The space became a sanctuary, a place of quiet contemplation and renewed creativity, rather than a mere base of operations. The world outside, of course, was still the same complex, often brutal place. Arthur's downfall had created ripples, not a utopia. New challenges emerged, new forms of corruption, new struggles for power. But my engagement with these issues was different. It was no longer personal vengeance, but a broader commitment to justice. I saw myself as a small part of a much larger, ongoing effort, a thread in a vast tapestry of global advocacy. This perspective brought with it a different kind of strength, one rooted in collective action rather than solitary heroism. My daughter, now a confident young woman, continued to inspire me. She was considering further studies in international human rights law, her passion ignited by the injustices she had witnessed and the tangible good she had helped achieve. We often worked on projects together, pooling our knowledge and perspectives. Her youthful idealism was a powerful counterpoint to my hard-won pragmatism, and together, we found a balance that was both effective and deeply fulfilling. Our mother-daughter bond, once forged in shared adversity, now thrived on shared purpose and mutual respect. The quiet, profound sense of peace was no longer a novelty, but a settled state of being. It was the peace of knowing one has fulfilled a difficult purpose, and then found an even deeper one. It was the peace of living authentically, aligned with one's deepest values. The story of retribution was indeed closed, a necessary, painful chapter. But the narrative that now unfolded was one of enduring hope, of tireless building, of a commitment to a world where justice was not just a concept, but a lived reality for all. And in that ongoing work, in that quiet, deliberate act of creation, I found my truest self, not as a destroyer of worlds, but as a steadfast architect of a better one. The architecture of hope was raised to protect, was reduced to a pittance, a mere allowance, contingent upon my absolute obedience to Arthur's decisions. My mother, too, was left with little more than a comfortable but dependent stipend. I remember the shock, a physical blow that stole my breath. I protested, my voice trembling with disbelief and outrage. These were not my father's wishes. He would never have disinherited me, never would he have left my mother so vulnerable. I demanded to see the original will, the one I knew existed, the one that upheld the centuries-old tradition of shared inheritance, of a family legacy divided fairly among its children. Arthur's face hardened. He calmly explained that the original will had been superseded, destroyed at my father's request. Silas chimed in, his voice oily with false sympathy, confirming the legality of the new document, citing obscure clauses and legal precedents. My mother, overwhelmed, could only weep softly. The world around me spun. The room, once a sanctuary of wisdom and paternal love, became a cage. I was being cast out, not physically, not yet, but stripped of my identity, my future, my very claim to the Blackwood name. It was a profound betrayal, a wound that went deeper than any physical injury. I was no longer the heir. I was a dependent, an inconvenience, a threat to Arthur's carefully constructed dominion. The months that followed were a blur of escalating tension and thinly veiled hostility. My protests, my attempts to rally my mother, my desperate pleas for justice, were all met with a wall of cold indifference from Arthur and the sneering condescension of Silas. They systematically isolated me, cutting off my access to family funds, restricting my movements, and subtly poisoning the minds of the few loyal staff who remained. The manor, once my home, became a gilded prison. I felt the weight of Arthur's gaze constantly upon me, a silent warning. His message was clear: accept your fate, or be cast out entirely. The final break came not with a bang, but with a whimper, a quiet eviction. One cold autumn morning, Arthur informed me that it was time for me to forge my own path, to make my own way in the world, unburdened by the responsibilities of the estate. He presented me with a single ticket to a distant city, a modest sum of money barely enough to cover a few months' rent, and a cold, dismissive look. My mother, heartbroken and powerless, could only embrace me tearfully, whispering apologies I knew were not hers to make. I stood on the gravel drive, a single worn suitcase in my hand, watching Blackwood Manor recede in the rearview mirror of the hired car. The stone walls, once a symbol of belonging, now seemed to mock me, their windows like empty eyes staring back at a ghost. The scent of roses was replaced by the bitter tang of betrayal. I was 18 years old, alone, disinherited, and utterly adrift. The world outside, the intricate, demanding patience and precision, far more complex than any act of destruction had ever been. Our days were filled not with the stark simplicity of vengeance, but with the nuanced shades of creation. We established community councils, not as mere governing bodies, but as living forums where every voice, no matter how small, could contribute to the collective tapestry of our future. My daughter Ilara possessed an uncanny ability to navigate these diverse perspectives, her arguments clear and compelling, her compassion a beacon. She understood that true justice was not just about equitable distribution of resources, but about the equitable distribution of dignity and opportunity. Our initial focus was on sustainable agriculture. The land, scarred by past conflicts, needed healing. We introduced innovative irrigation techniques, drawing upon ancient wisdom and modern scientific understanding. Ilara spearheaded a project to reintroduce native flora, understanding that biodiversity was not just an ecological concern but a cornerstone of a resilient society. I, in turn, focused on infrastructure, rebuilding the shattered pathways of trade and communication. Bridges that once lay in ruins now spanned rivers, connecting disparate villages and fostering a sense of shared destiny. Our work was less about grand pronouncements and more about the quiet, persistent labor of hands in the soil, of minds collaborating over blueprints, of hearts slowly mending. The peace we had cultivated was not an absence of challenge, but a presence of purpose. There were still disagreements, moments of frustration, and the lingering shadows of old prejudices. Some communities, accustomed to generations of animosity, found it difficult to extend trust. Others harbored resentment over past injustices, even when the perpetrators were long gone. These were the subtle fissures in our foundation, and they required careful, empathetic repair. Ilara often reminded me that healing was not a single event, but a continuous process, like the slow erosion of a mountain by a persistent stream. One such challenge arose from the remote highlands, where a group of independent-minded settlements had long maintained their isolation. Their traditional ways, while rich in cultural heritage, often clashed with the broader principles of interconnectedness and shared governance we were advocating. They viewed our efforts with suspicion, seeing them as an encroachment on their autonomy, a new form of control disguised as benevolence. Their leaders, stern and unyielding, refused to participate in the regional councils, fearing their unique identity would be diluted. Ilara saw this not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as an opportunity for understanding. She proposed a series of cultural exchanges, not as a means to convert them to our way of thinking, but to foster mutual respect. I, ever the pragmatist, initially questioned the efficiency of such an approach. My instinct was to demonstrate the tangible benefits of cooperation, to prove our methods through results. But Ilara argued that genuine change could not be imposed. It had to be cultivated from within, through shared experience and empathy. So we embarked on a diplomatic mission, not with armed escorts or grand pronouncements, but with gifts of seeds adapted to their high-altitude climate, and with an open invitation to share their stories and crafts. Ilara, with her inherent grace, spent weeks living among them, learning their language, participating in their rituals, and listening intently to their concerns. She did not preach or persuade. She simply existed as an embodiment of our intentions. I observed from a distance, coordinating logistical support and ensuring their needs were met without interference. It was a delicate dance, requiring immense patience and a willingness to set aside our own preconceived notions. Slowly, painstakingly, the ice began to thaw. The Highlanders saw that Ilara was not there to dominate, but to learn. They witnessed her genuine respect for their traditions, her willingness to offer help without demanding subservience. They began to share their own knowledge of medicinal plants and sustainable foraging, contributing invaluable insights to our broader ecological initiatives. It was a testament to Ilara's approach that by the time she returned, she brought with her not just an agreement for limited cooperation, but a deep, personal connection with their elders, a bond forged in shared humanity. This experience solidified my understanding of Ilara's unique strength. My path had been one of forceful action, of breaking down barriers with resolve, and often with a necessary degree of ruthlessness. Hers was one of gentle persuasion, of building bridges with understanding and empathy. We were two sides of the same coin, each essential for the monumental task at hand. My pragmatism provided the framework, the structure, the hard-won lessons of consequence. Her idealism infused it with life, with the spirit of inclusivity and the unwavering belief in the inherent goodness of people. As our initiatives gained traction, the ripple effect became palpable. Education became a cornerstone. We established schools in every village, not just for children but for adults too, offering vocational training and literacy programs. The old scrolls, once hidden away in dusty archives, were brought out and shared, their wisdom illuminating our path. Access to clean water and health care, once luxuries, became fundamental rights. The shift was profound, moving from a culture of scarcity and suspicion to one of abundance and mutual aid. I found myself increasingly in the role of a strategic planner, a long-term visionary. My mind, once consumed by the intricate details of a devastating campaign, now charted the trajectory of generations. How could we ensure that the peace we built was not merely a temporary respite, but a self-sustaining ecosystem of justice? How could we inoculate future generations against the poisons of division and hatred? These were the questions that occupied my thoughts during the quiet hours, when the world outside was hushed, and only the soft glow of a lamp illuminated my maps and schematics. Ilara, meanwhile, became the heart of the movement, her presence inspiring hope wherever she went. She organized youth summits, empowering the next generation to take ownership of their future. She championed the arts, understanding that creativity was a vital expression of a thriving society, a way to process collective trauma and imagine new possibilities. Her laughter echoed through the community halls, a sound that was once rare and precious, now a constant melody. Our mother-daughter bond deepened further, evolving beyond shared purpose into a profound, almost telepathic understanding. A glance, a subtle shift in posture, a barely perceptible sigh, these were enough to convey complex thoughts and emotions between us. We completed each other's sentences, anticipated each other's needs, and offered unspoken reassurance in moments of doubt. It was a partnership born of fire and tempered by peace, a testament to the enduring power of familial love, redefined and strengthened by shared ideals. The world we were building was not a utopia. There were still remnants of the past that occasionally flared up, a petty theft, a resurgence of old grievances, a natural disaster that tested our resilience. But these were no longer existential threats. They were challenges to be met with collective strength, with the systems of support and justice we had so carefully constructed. We had learned that peace was not the absence of problems, but the presence of effective mechanisms for resolving them. My own internal landscape had transformed entirely. The rage that once fueled my every action had long since dissipated, replaced by a quiet, unwavering resolve. The burden of retribution, once a heavy cloak, had fallen away, leaving me lighter, more open. I still carried the memories of what I had done, the choices I had made, but they no longer defined me. They served as a constant reminder of the fragility of peace, the cost of hatred, and the immense responsibility that came with power. I had found my truest self, not in the solitary pursuit of vengeance, but in the collective act of creation. It was a self rooted in connection, in responsibility, in the quiet joy of watching a community flourish. The architect of a better world was not a title I had sought, but one that had found me, forged in the crucible of my past, and refined by the enduring hope of my present. The narrative of my life had indeed shifted, from a solitary quest for justice to a shared journey of building, of nurturing, of ensuring that the seeds of peace we planted today would bear fruit for generations to come. And in that ongoing tireless work, I found a satisfaction that transcended all previous experiences, a profound and lasting peace that resonated deep within my soul. As the years turned, our efforts began to yield fruits that exceeded even our most optimistic projections. The once barren lands blossomed with diverse crops, creating food security and even a surplus for trade. Artisan guilds flourished, producing goods of exceptional quality that brought economic stability and cultural pride. The regional councils, once viewed with suspicion, had evolved into vibrant forums of democratic decision-making, where differences were debated openly and resolutions forged through consensus. Ilara's vision of inclusive governance had taken root, demonstrating that true power lay not in dominance but in shared responsibility. My role, too, continued to evolve. I found myself increasingly mentoring younger leaders, guiding them through the complexities of resource management, strategic planning, and crisis resolution. I shared my hard-won lessons, not as prescriptive rules, but as cautionary tales and frameworks for critical thought. The pragmatism that had once served as a shield now became a tool for empowerment, helping others anticipate challenges and build robust solutions. I taught them that true strength lay in foresight and adaptability, not in rigid adherence to any single doctrine. We also faced new, unforeseen challenges. Climate shifts brought unpredictable weather patterns, testing the resilience of our agricultural systems. Distant communities, still grappling with the aftermath of their own conflicts, sometimes sought refuge in our lands, presenting us with the ethical complexities of aid and integration. These were not enemies to be vanquished, but human dilemmas to be navigated with compassion and ingenuity. We learned to adapt, to innovate, and to extend our principles of justice and sustainability beyond our immediate borders. Ilara's influence grew exponentially. Her reputation as a compassionate and insightful leader spread far and wide. She became a sought-after mediator in disputes between neighboring regions, her ability to bridge divides and foster understanding proving invaluable. She traveled extensively, sharing our models of governance and sustainable living, always emphasizing that our success was not due to any unique genius, but to the collective effort of a community committed to peace. She never sought personal glory, always deflecting praise to the people whose lives she touched. I observed her with a quiet pride that transcended words. She had taken the foundations I helped lay and built upon them a structure of unparalleled grace and strength. Her idealism, once a youthful counterpoint to my pragmatism, had matured into a profound wisdom, tempered by experience but never diminished. She understood that while my generation had focused on repairing the damage, hers had the sacred duty of building a future that would prevent such damage from ever occurring again. Our evenings often found us together, not in formal council, but in the quiet comfort of our shared home, perhaps overlooking the thriving fields that stretched towards the horizon. We would discuss the day's events, the challenges overcome, the dreams yet to be realized. Sometimes, we simply sat in comfortable silence, the unspoken understanding between us a balm to the soul. In those moments, I could see not just my daughter, but the embodiment of all that we had fought for, all that we had built. She was the living legacy, the enduring hope. The quiet, profound sense of peace had indeed become a settled state of being, but it was not static. It was a dynamic, evolving peace, constantly challenged and reaffirmed by the ongoing work of creation. It was the peace of knowing that one's life, once a tempest of pain and purpose, had found its true north in service, in the arduous, but immensely rewarding task of nurturing a world where justice was not just a concept, but the very air that people breathed. My personal narrative had found its resolution, not in a final act, but in an endless continuation. I was no longer defined by the battles I had fought, but by the bridges I had helped to build. The destroyer had become an architect, the avenger a guardian. My truest self, I realized, was not a fixed identity but a continuous becoming, shaped by the needs of the world and the boundless potential of human spirit. And in that ongoing journey, hand in hand with my daughter, I found not just peace, but a deep, abiding joy that illuminated every step of our shared path. The story of retribution was indeed closed, a necessary, painful chapter. But the narrative that now unfolded was one of enduring hope, of tireless building, of a commitment to a world where justice was not just a concept, but a lived reality for all. And in that ongoing work, in that quiet, deliberate act of creation, I found my truest self not as a destroyer of worlds, but as a steadfast architect of a better one. The horizon stretched, ever expanding, inviting new visions, new endeavors. We initiated a grand project to reclaim the desertified regions, employing ancient water harvesting techniques combined with advanced bioengineering. It was a monumental undertaking, requiring immense resources and the collective will of numerous communities. Ilara, with her innate ability to inspire, rallied thousands of volunteers, orchestrating a complex network of labor and expertise. I focused on securing the necessary long-term funding and establishing international partnerships, ensuring the sustainability of such ambitious projects. Our work was no longer confined to our immediate region. Its scope had broadened to encompass a global vision of ecological and social restoration. This expansion brought new complexities. Interacting with diverse cultures and political systems required a delicate balance of firmness and diplomacy. Some foreign entities, still clinging to old models of exploitation, viewed our sustainable practices as a threat to their own resource-intensive economies. They attempted to undermine our efforts through misinformation campaigns and economic pressure. These were not direct confrontations but insidious attempts to sow discord and doubt. Ilara and I tackled these challenges with a unified front. She, with her eloquent articulation of our values and the undeniable success of our models, countered the misinformation with truth and transparency. She spoke of the interconnectedness of all life, of the shared responsibility we bore for the planet, of a future where prosperity was measured not by accumulation, but by well-being. I, drawing on my deep understanding of power dynamics and strategic foresight, devised economic countermeasures and built alliances with like-minded nations and organizations, demonstrating that a sustainable future was not only ethical but also economically viable. Our partnership proved to be an unbreakable shield and an irresistible force. Her unwavering belief in humanity's capacity for good acted as a moral compass, while my pragmatic understanding of the world's complexities provided the navigational charts. We were a living testament to the idea that strength could be found not just in individual prowess, but in the harmonious integration of diverse perspectives. One particular instance stands out in my memory. A powerful consortium of mining corporations, eager to exploit a newly discovered mineral deposit in a pristine wilderness area adjacent to our reclaimed lands, sought to negotiate a deal with a smaller, less developed neighboring nation. Their proposal promised immediate wealth, but threatened irreversible environmental damage and the displacement of indigenous communities. The leaders of this nation, desperate for economic upliftment, were on the verge of accepting. Ilara intervened, not with condemnation, but with an alternative vision. She presented a comprehensive plan for sustainable development, one that leveraged their existing natural resources in an environmentally responsible manner, empowered their local workforce, and preserved their cultural heritage. She showed them how long-term prosperity, built on respect for their land and people, far outweighed the ephemeral gains offered by external exploitation. I, in turn, provided the technical expertise and financial backing to make her vision a tangible reality, connecting them with our network of sustainable development experts and investors. It was a protracted battle of ideas and wills, but Ilara's conviction, coupled with our proven track record, ultimately prevailed. The neighboring nation chose the path of sustainable development, forging a powerful alliance with us. This victory was not just about preventing environmental destruction. It was about demonstrating that a different way was possible, that nations could thrive without sacrificing their values or their future. It was a victory for the very principles we had dedicated our lives to upholding. Watching Ilara lead, I often reflected on the profound transformation within myself. The person who had once wielded immense destructive power, driven by a singular, consuming purpose, was now the quiet force behind a global movement for creation and preservation. The scars of my past remained, etched into my memory, but they no longer festered. They served as a constant reminder of the darkness from which we had emerged, and the preciousness of the light we now cultivated. My peace was no longer just a personal solace. It was a shared endeavor, a collective aspiration. It was the peace of seeing children learn in schools powered by renewable energy, of witnessing communities resolve their differences through dialogue rather than conflict, of knowing that the choices we made today were safeguarding the well-being of generations yet unborn. It was the peace of a life lived in service, aligned with the grand, unfolding narrative of a better world. The work was endless, the challenges constantly evolving, but so too was our capacity to meet them. The world was a vast, intricate tapestry, and we were but two threads, weaving our part into its grand design. And in that ongoing, tireless act of creation, in the quiet, deliberate commitment to justice and hope, I found my truest self, not as a destroyer of worlds, but as a steadfast architect of a better one, alongside the daughter who had shown me the enduring power of compassion and the boundless potential of a shared future. Our legacy would not be one of vengeance, but of generations living in harmony, a testament to the transformative power of purpose, peace, and unwavering hope. The quiet hum of the central nexus, a network of interconnected data streams and energy conduits that now powered a unified world, was the soundtrack to our days. It was a sound of constant creation, a subtle counterpoint to the distant echoes of what had once been. My daughter, Ilara, moved through its intricate pathways with an innate grace, her presence a beacon of calm efficiency. We were no longer reacting to crises of our own making, but proactively sculpting a future, one carefully considered decision, one compassionate interaction at a time. The grand tapestry, as I had come to see it, was not merely being woven, it was being designed, thread by painstaking thread, by countless hands guided by a shared vision. Our work spanned continents and cultures, often focusing on the delicate art of reintegration. The scars of past conflicts ran deep, not just in the ravaged landscapes, but in the collective psyche of the people. It was one thing to declare peace, another entirely to cultivate it within hearts hardened by generations of distrust. Ilara often spoke of the importance of narrative, of replacing the old stories of vengeance and grievance with new ones of shared purpose and mutual respect. She championed initiatives that brought children from formerly warring regions together, not in formal classrooms, but in communal gardens where they learned to nurture life, or in creative workshops where they built structures that symbolized their aspirations for unity. I, in my role, often found myself navigating the more entrenched political and economic currents. The restructuring of resource distribution, the fair allocation of previously contested territories, the establishment of equitable trade routes, these were the bedrock upon which lasting peace could be built. It was a painstaking process, often fraught with lingering suspicion and the subtle machinations of those who still clung to old power structures. My past, once a burden, now sometimes served as an unexpected tool. The memory of the destructive force I had once wielded, though a source of perpetual introspection and regret, occasionally lent a certain gravitas to my pronouncements, a silent reminder of the precipice from which we had collectively retreated. It was a strange irony to leverage the ghost of my former self in service of harmony. One particular challenge arose in the Northern Territories, a region historically rich in rare earth minerals, which had been a flashpoint for centuries. Two distinct ethnic groups, the Highlanders and the Valley Dwellers, had fought over its control with brutal regularity. Even after the Great Unification, residual tensions simmered, threatening to erupt whenever a new mining license was proposed, or a boundary marker shifted. Ilara proposed an innovative solution. A joint stewardship council, composed equally of representatives from both communities, with binding arbitration from an independent ecological oversight body. The council would not only manage resource extraction, but also oversee environmental restoration and cultural preservation projects, funded by a percentage of the mineral profits. The initial resistance was fierce. The Highlanders felt their ancestral rights were being eroded. The Valley Dwellers feared being sidelined again. Hours turned into days, days into weeks, of intense dialogue. Ilara, with her patient demeanor and uncanny ability to articulate a vision of shared prosperity, became the bridge. She spoke not just of resources, but of the intertwined destinies of their children, of the land itself as a sacred inheritance to be protected, not merely exploited. She reminded them that true strength lay not in dominance, but in collaboration. I, for my part, provided the logistical frameworks, the economic models that demonstrated the tangible benefits of cooperation, and the security protocols that assured both sides of their safety and autonomy within the new framework. There were moments of despair, of course. A particularly heated session saw tempers flare, and old grievances resurface with a venomous intensity. A delegate from the Highlanders, a grizzled elder named Kale, accused the valley dwellers of historical deceit, citing ancient texts. A young, impassioned valley representative, Lyra, retorted with tales of recent injustices. The room crackled with animosity, threatening to unravel weeks of painstaking progress. It was Ilara who stepped in, not with a reprimand, but with a simple, yet profound question. She asked Kale to describe the most beautiful place in his homeland, a place he cherished above all others. He spoke of a hidden waterfall, its waters cascading into a crystal-clear pool, surrounded by ancient lichen-covered rocks. Then she asked Lyra the same question. Lyra described a sun-drenched meadow, teeming with wildflowers, where her grandmother had taught her the songs of their people. Ilara then gently pointed out that both these places, these sacred spaces, were sustained by the same river, flowing from the high peaks to the fertile valleys. Their survival was intrinsically linked. Their stories, though different, were woven into the same landscape. It was a simple metaphor, yet it resonated deeply, cutting through the layers of historical animosity to touch a shared humanity. The breakthrough was subtle, but palpable. The conversation shifted from accusations to shared vulnerability, from past wrongs to future possibilities. The silence that followed Ilara's simple observation was not the heavy, suffocating kind that had often settled upon their previous meetings. It was a contemplative quiet, a space for thought to unfurl. Kale, whose usual posture was one of rigid defiance, leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if seeing the distant peak she had referenced. Lyra, usually vibrant and quick to challenge, had softened. Her eyes, previously alight with indignation, now held a glimmer of introspection. I watched them, holding my breath, understanding that this moment, this delicate equilibrium, was as fragile as a spider's silk in the morning dew. I let the silence linger, resisting the urge to fill it with more words, knowing that true understanding required internal processing. Finally, Kale cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to break a spell. He did not look at Lyra, but spoke to me, his voice rougher than usual. He said I let the silence linger, resisting the urge to fill it with more words, knowing that true understanding required internal processing. Finally, Kale cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to break a spell. He did not look at Lyra, but spoke to me, his voice rougher than usual. He said I had always been one to see the cracks in the foundation, even when others were busy admiring the edifice. A curious statement, delivered with a hint of something I could not quite place. Perhaps grudging respect, perhaps weary resignation. It was not an accusation, nor was it praise in the conventional sense, but an observation of my particular way of seeing the world, a way that often brought uncomfortable truths to light. Lyra stirred beside me, a barely perceptible shift in her posture, but she remained silent, her gaze still fixed on some inner landscape. Ilara, ever the quiet observer, offered a small, knowing smile that did not quite reach her eyes, a smile that spoke of a shared understanding of the world's inherent brokenness, a silent acknowledgement of the burdens we all carried, often alone. It was a smile that suggested she too saw the cracks, perhaps even some I had missed, and that she knew the true cost of trying to mend them. Kale shifted his weight, his gaze still avoiding Lyra, fixed instead on a point beyond my shoulder, as if contemplating a distant horizon. He let out a slow breath, a sound like air escaping a long-held secret. He said my observation was not new to him, that he had seen the way my mind worked since I was but a novice, always peeling back the layers others were content to admire. He added that it was a gift and a curse to possess such vision. There was a weariness in his voice now, deeper than before, a fatigue that seemed to emanate not from physical exertion, but from the weight of years spent navigating those very foundations I was only just beginning to truly perceive. His words hung in the air, a heavy shroud woven from regret and a profound, almost ancient wisdom. It was not a judgment, not truly, but an observation born of experience, a warning veiled as an acknowledgment. I understood then that his weariness was not merely physical, though he had endured much. It was the fatigue of a soul that had seen too much, understood too deeply, and perhaps tried too hard to hold together what was destined to crumble. My own mind, ever the restless current, began to churn through his statement. A gift and a curse. It was a duality I had felt stirring within me for as long as I could remember, though I had never articulated it with such stark clarity. The gift, I supposed, was the ability to see beyond the surface, to discern the intricate lattice of cause and effect, to sense the underlying currents that shaped events and individuals. It allowed me to anticipate, to see the ability to anticipate, to circumvent pitfalls, to navigate the treacherous currents of human interaction with an uncanny accuracy. It was a subtle whisper, a shadow on the periphery of vision, a faint scent on the wind that spoke of coming storms long before the clouds gathered. It allowed me to see the unraveling thread in the tapestry of events, to trace the subtle shifts in allegiance, the nascent seeds of betrayal, the quiet blossoming of opportunity. This foresight, this almost preternatural understanding of trajectories, had saved me countless times. It had guided my decisions, often against the counsel of others, leading me down paths that, in retrospect, proved to be the only viable ones. It was a compass that pointed not to true north, but to the most probable future, a map etched with the contours of what was to come. But then, the curse. The other side of the coin, inextricably bound. To see the future was often to see the inevitable, to witness the slow, agonizing unraveling of hope, the quiet dissolution of bonds, the inevitable decay of all things I held dear, even those I fought with every fiber of my being to preserve. It was a torment beyond measure, this gift that was also a shackles. My foresight, once my greatest ally, became my most insidious torturer. It showed me the precipice, the crumbling edge, the unseen chasm, but often it also showed me the invisible chains that bound me to that trajectory, the intricate web of causality that made escape impossible. The irony was a bitter draught. I could see the coming storm, feel the first drops of rain, taste the metallic tang of lightning in the air, yet sometimes the very act of knowing rendered me inert. To warn, to intervene, was often to become the catalyst for the very event I sought to prevent. The future, in its cruel wisdom, often incorporated my attempts to thwart it, weaving my resistance into its fabric, making my struggle a part of its design. It was a cosmic joke, played out on the stage of my own existence. I was not merely an observer. I was a player, yet a player who knew the script, knew the tragic ending, and was forced to deliver lines that only hastened the catastrophe. This curse manifested in 1,000 subtle ways, each one a fresh wound. I saw the nascent flicker of betrayal in a trusted friend's eyes, the moment doubt took root, the slow, imperceptible shift in allegiance that would eventually lead to their turning. I saw the illness that would claim sheltered walls of Blackwood was a harsh, unforgiving place. I landed in a bustling metropolis, a concrete jungle where my aristocratic upbringing was a meaningless relic, my family name a forgotten whisper. For the first time in my life, I knew hunger, true hardship, and the crushing weight of anonymity. I took whatever work I could find, laboring in kitchens, cleaning offices, learning the brutal realities of survival. My hands, once accustomed to quill and parchment, grew calloused and rough. My mind, once filled with grand visions of heritage, focused solely on the next meal, the next rent payment. But even in the darkest corners of my despair, the fire of my resolve never truly extinguished. It smoldered, a tiny ember protected by the ashes of my grief and anger. Every slight, every hardship, every dismissive glance from strangers fueled it. I was no longer the naive boy who believed in the inherent goodness of family. I was a survivor, forged in the crucible of injustice. I devoured books, not for pleasure, but for knowledge, for strategy. I studied finance, law, history, psychology. I learned about the intricate dance of power, the subtle art of manipulation, the vulnerabilities of even the most formidable empires. I observed people, their motivations, their weaknesses, their desires. I understood that wealth was not just about money. It was about influence, networks, information. My early years of exile were a period of intense, self-imposed education. I worked tirelessly, saved every penny, and invested cautiously, learning the ropes of the market from the ground up. I sought out mentors, unlikely allies who saw a spark in me, a raw intelligence, and an unyielding will that transcended my humble circumstances. One such mentor was an elderly, reclusive financier named Elias Vance, a man who had built and lost fortunes multiple times. He saw in me the drive he once possessed and took me under his wing, teaching me the intricate, often ruthless ways of high finance. He taught me about leverage, about hidden assets, about the art of the long game. He taught me patience, the most dangerous weapon of all. Elias, with his cynical wisdom, once told me that the greatest revenge is not swift retribution, but the quiet, methodical dismantling of your enemy's world, piece by painful piece. His words resonated deep within me, echoing the nascent plan that was slowly, meticulously forming in my mind. I moved from menial jobs to junior positions in finance firms, then to increasingly influential roles. Always learning, always observing. I built a new identity, a new name, a new persona. The disinherited boy of Blackwood Manor ceased to exist. In his place stood a shrewd, ambitious, and utterly unremarkable businessman, moving through the world with a quiet efficiency that masked a burning intensity. I cultivated connections, built a network of contacts across various industries, and quietly amassed a considerable fortune, far exceeding the paltry sum I was given years ago. Each successful venture, each carefully negotiated deal, was, loved one, not as a sudden, shocking blow, but as a creeping shadow, a gradual fading that began long before any symptoms were outwardly visible. I watched the laughter die in their eyes, the strength ebb from their limbs, the light dim, all while they, oblivious, lived their present, full of unburdened joy. And I, armed with this terrible knowledge, could do nothing but smile back, a ghost at the feast, already mourning a loss that had not yet occurred. Relationships became a minefield of foreknowledge. How could one truly engage, truly love, truly surrender to the spontaneous dance of human connection, when one already knew the precise moment of its fracture, the exact nature of its end? Every tender word, every shared secret, every intimate touch was tinged with the melancholy of its eventual demise. It was like holding a delicate, exquisite glass sculpture, knowing precisely when and how it would shatter. The beauty was undeniable, but the fragility, the impending destruction, overshadowed it all. I learned to build walls, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, futile attempt to shield myself from the inevitable pain. I kept people at arm's length, not because I disliked them, but because I already knew the exact measure of sorrow their eventual departure would bring. This made me seem distant, aloof, perhaps even cold to those who sought closeness. They could not understand the burden I carried, the silent elegy I was constantly composing in my mind for futures that were still, to them, vibrant and alive. The simple pleasures of life, too, were often corrupted. A beautiful sunset, a perfect meal, a moment of profound peace, all were viewed through the lens of their fleeting nature. I saw not just the beauty of the present, but the inevitable return of night, the eventual hunger, the coming storm. The joy was always tempered by the knowledge of its expiration date, a silent countdown ticking in the background of every seemingly perfect moment. It was impossible to live fully in the now, to be truly present, when the future was a constant, insistent whisper in my ear, detailing the erosion of all things. There were times, too, when the future presented not a tragedy, but a triumph, a moment of great success or happiness. Yet even these were tainted. The struggle, the uncertainty, the striving that made achievements so sweet for others, was often absent for me. I knew the outcome. The path might be arduous, the obstacles formidable, but if the end was guaranteed, the journey lost its edge, its raw, exhilarating suspense. It was like reading a book where I already knew every twist and turn, every character's fate. The narrative unfolded, but the surprise, the wonder, the true engagement was diminished, replaced by a detached observation. I moved through life, as if walking a pre-drawn line, knowing the destination, but still forced to take every step, each one a dull echo of a foregone conclusion. The greatest torment, perhaps, was the erosion of free will, or at least the illusion of it. If I saw a future, however distant, however improbable it seemed to others, was it truly inevitable? Or was my seeing it merely a reflection of a path already chosen, a decision already made by some unseen hand? The very act of perceiving a future seemed to solidify it, to imbue it with an unshakable reality. I struggled with this paradox endlessly. Was I merely a prophet, foretelling events that would occur regardless of my knowledge, or was my knowledge itself a component of the causal chain, an unwitting participant in shaping the destiny I observed? The weight of this uncertainty was crushing. It robbed me of agency, making my choices feel less like acts of will and more like preordained motions. I tried, in my younger, more naive days, to fight against it, to defy the prophecies, to wrench the tapestry of fate from its loom and reweave it with my own hands. I saw a dear friend, a brilliant scholar, destined for a path of self-destruction, spiraling into addiction and despair. I intervened, subtly at first, then more overtly. I offered help, guidance, distractions. I tried to steer him away from the influences I knew would consume him. For a time, it seemed I was successful. He thrived, his intellect shining, his future bright. I felt a surge of triumph, a rare moment of victory over the relentless march of inevitability. But then, the future I had glimpsed, the one I had fought so hard to avert, reasserted itself, not in the exact form I had seen, but in a new, more insidious guise. His addiction took a different form, his despair found a new outlet, and the end, though slightly altered in its details, arrived nonetheless, perhaps even more painfully because of the detour. It was a lesson etched in sorrow. The river might be diverted, but its waters would still find their way to the sea. The destination remained, only the path changed. My interference, far from preventing the tragedy, had merely reshaped it, perhaps even prolonged the suffering by offering a false hope. After that, a profound weariness settled upon me. The fight seemed futile, the struggle pointless. I learned to observe, to anticipate, but to rarely interfere directly with the larger currents of destiny. I became adept at navigating the eddies and currents, finding the safest passage for myself and those I cared for, but always within the confines of the broader, predetermined flow. I could save a ship from a particular rock, but I could not prevent the storm from eventually capsizing it, nor could I prevent it from eventually reaching its fated port, no matter how distant. This acceptance, born of exhaustion and repeated disappointment, brought a peculiar kind of peace, a detached serenity that others often mistook for wisdom or indifference. I no longer raged against the machine. I simply understood its workings. The world unfolded before me like a slow-motion drama, every act, every scene, every line of dialogue already known. I could appreciate the artistry, the intricate plotting, the subtle character development, But the element of surprise, the thrilling unknown, was forever denied to me. The burden of this knowledge isolated me profoundly. How could I explain to others the weight I carried, the silent screams I heard from futures yet to arrive? How could I share my joy or sorrow when their perceptions were so limited, so confined to the immediate present? They lived in a vibrant, unpredictable world, full of potential and peril, triumphs and tragedies that truly surprised them. I lived in a world where the script was already written, where the climax had already been performed in my mind's eye, long before the actors took the stage. This created an unbridgeable chasm between myself and others. I became a solitary figure, observing, understanding, but rarely truly participating. My empathy was deep, precisely because I saw the full arc of their lives, their struggles, their eventual fates. But this empathy was also a source of constant pain, a shared sorrow that no one else could comprehend. I learned to speak in riddles, in metaphors, dropping hints that would only make sense in retrospect, after the events had unfolded. It was a safer way to share my knowledge, a way to guide without overtly defying the threads of fate. Sometimes, people would remember my words years later, a sudden flash of recognition as a prophecy came true, a chilling realization of the deeper meaning behind my seemingly cryptic advice. But by then, it was always too late to change anything fundamental. The knowledge served only to confirm what had already transpired, to illuminate the path that had always been. The nature of time itself became a fluid, terrifying concept. For others, it was a linear progression, past, present, future, distinct and separate. For me, it was a vast, interconnected web, where moments from the future could bleed into the present, where echoes of what was to come resonated with what was now. The boundaries blurred. I existed in a perpetual state of temporal displacement, always straddling multiple points on the timeline. This made simple things complicated. Planning for the future was less about making choices and more about aligning with pre-existing outcomes. Remembering the past was often intertwined with remembering how I had foreseen it, creating a complex, layered memory that was never quite pure. Sleep offered little respite. My dreams were often vivid, fragmented glimpses of what was to come, a chaotic jumble of possibilities and certainties. Sometimes, they were clearer than my waking visions, offering stark, undeniable truths that would haunt me upon waking. There was no escape, no true oblivion. The future was always there, a relentless tide lapping at the shores of my consciousness. Over the decades, I have seen empires rise and fall, witnessed revolutions ignite and sputter out, watched technology transform the world in ways unimaginable to previous generations. And through it all, I have carried this dual burden, the clarity of foresight and the paralysis of inevitability. It has shaped me, molded me into the person I am today, a quiet observer, a reluctant prophet, a soul burdened with too much knowledge and too little power to wield it effectively against the grand designs of destiny. The world continues its endless march. People live, love, strive, suffer, and die, all unaware of the intricate, predetermined dance they are performing. And I watch. I understand. I anticipate. And I carry the heavy, silent weight of all that is to come, a prisoner of my own extraordinary, yet ultimately tragic, gift. I have seen the end of so many stories, witnessed the final chapters written long before the first words were penned. This constant exposure to conclusions has made me question the meaning of beginnings, the purpose of the journey. If the destination is already known, is there truly free will, or are we all merely actors playing out a script handed down by an unseen author? My own life, too, has unfolded with a similar predictability. I have seen my own triumphs, my own sorrows, my own eventual end. This knowledge, above all else, is the heaviest chain. To know the precise moment of my own demise, the circumstances that will lead to it, the faces of those who will be present or absent, it strips away the last vestiges of surprise, of the precious human illusion of control. I walk towards my own finale with a quiet resignation, knowing the script, understanding the motivations, even recognizing the very words I will utter in my last moments. This is not to say I am without hope. Hope, for me, has transformed into something different, something more stoic. It is not the hope of changing the grand tapestry, but the hope of navigating it with grace, of finding small moments of beauty and connection within the predetermined flow. It is the hope that my understanding, however painful, might allow me to ease the suffering of others in minor ways, to offer a word of comfort, a moment of presence, even if the larger tragedy cannot be averted. It is the hope that perhaps, by bearing this burden, I am fulfilling some unknown purpose, playing a necessary role in the cosmic drama. But the pervasive feeling remains one of profound loneliness. Who could ever truly share this burden? Who could understand the weight of knowing not just what is, but what will be, and what could never be otherwise? My companions are the echoes of futures past and futures yet to come, a constant chorus of whispers that only I can hear. I have learned to cherish the fleeting present, not for its unpredictability, for there is little of that left for me, but for its tangibility. The warmth of the sun on my skin, the taste of a good meal, the sound of a child's laughter. These are real, immediate, undeniable. They are anchors in a temporal sea that constantly threatens to pull me into the currents of what is to come. These moments, however brief, however tinged with the knowledge of their impermanence, are the small oases in my desert of foresight. The world outside my own consciousness remains largely oblivious. People continue to plan, to dream, to fear, to hope, all with the innocent belief that their choices truly dictate their destinies. And perhaps, for them, they do. Perhaps my curse is unique, a singular aberration in the grand scheme of things. Or perhaps we are all merely players in a cosmic play, and I am simply the unfortunate soul who was handed the full script, while everyone else only gets their lines one scene at a time. The thought is both terrifying and strangely comforting. Terrifying, because it diminishes the very essence of human striving. Comforting, because it absolves me of the crushing responsibility I sometimes feel, the responsibility of knowing without being able to truly act. So I continue to exist, a living paradox. A guide who cannot truly lead, a prophet who cannot truly save, a witness to a future that is already, in my mind, a memory. The gift and the curse, forever entwined, forever shaping my perception of reality, forever defining the boundaries of my existence. I am a sentinel on the edge of time, watching the endless parade of moments, each one arriving precisely when I knew it would, each one fulfilling a destiny I had already glimpsed. And in this endless vigil I find a strange, quiet dignity, a melancholic acceptance of my unique, solitary fate. The tapestry continues to weave itself, thread by predetermined thread, and I, the silent weaver, can only watch. Not just a financial gain, it was a brick laid in the foundation of my grand design. I learned to play the game better than Arthur ever could, because I understood what it meant to lose everything, to truly fight for survival. He had been given his kingdom. I had to build mine from the ground up, brick by painful brick. Years turned into decades. My youth faded, replaced by the lines of experience and the steady gaze of a man who knew precisely what he wanted. I rarely spoke of my past, allowing the narrative of my self-made success to solidify. No one connected the successful, enigmatic figure I had become with the forgotten heir of Blackwood. This anonymity was my greatest asset, my invisible shield. While Arthur reveled in his inherited glory, believing himself invincible, I was working in the shadows, gathering intelligence, identifying weaknesses, and preparing for the perfect moment to strike. I knew Blackwood Manor, its finances, its vulnerabilities, better than Arthur ever would. I had access to information he could only dream of, thanks to the vast network I had painstakingly built. I knew the key players, the loyalties of the staff, the hidden passages, the secret strengths and weaknesses of the estate itself. My plan was not one of crude vengeance, of burning it all down. No, that would be too simple, too satisfying in a fleeting way. My plan was far more intricate, a slow-motion unraveling, a meticulous reclamation. It was about justice, about restoring what was rightfully mine, and in doing so, exposing the hollowness of Arthur's reign, the illegitimacy of his claim. It was about showing the world, and more importantly, Arthur himself, that he was merely a caretaker of a legacy he never truly earned, a legacy he had stolen. The Blackwood name, the Blackwood estate, it was all mine by birth, by spirit, and soon, by strategic force. The first phase of the plan involved a deep dive into the current state of Blackwood's finances. I had my sources, quiet whispers from within, carefully cultivated over years. Arthur, it turned out, was not the astute businessman he pretended to be. He was a lavish spender, prone to risky investments and expensive whims. He had slowly, systematically bled the estate dry, selling off portions of the land, mortgaging assets, all to maintain a facade of grandiosity that was crumbling from within. The Blackwood name, once a symbol of unwavering prosperity, was now teetering on the brink of financial ruin, propped up by a house of cards. This knowledge ignited a cold fury within me, but also a grim satisfaction. His greed had created the very opportunity I needed. He had unwittingly paved the way for my return. My next step involved acquiring key leverage. Over the years, I had quietly purchased significant shares in several of the companies that were heavily invested in the Blackwood estate, or held its loans. I did this through a series of shell corporations, carefully obscuring my true identity. No one could trace these transactions back to me. I was a phantom shareholder, a silent partner, slowly accumulating power from the periphery. I also began to identify and cultivate relationships with individuals who held influence in the local community, people who had grown disillusioned with Arthur's arrogance and mismanagement. These were the old families, the local gentry, the long-serving employees, all of whom remembered my father with reverence and viewed Arthur with a mixture of disdain and concern. I also needed a physical presence, a base of operations near Blackwood, but far enough removed to avoid immediate suspicion. I found it in an old, neglected hunting lodge on the edge of the Blackwood lands, a property that had fallen into disrepair and was quietly put up for sale by a distant relative of its former owners, unaware of its strategic value. I purchased it under another assumed name, of course, and began its meticulous restoration, transforming it into a modern command center, equipped with the latest technology, yet blending seamlessly with the rustic charm of the surrounding landscape. From here I could observe, plan, and execute. The lodge became my sanctuary, my war room, a place where the past and future converged. The air there, though distant from Blackwood Manor, still carried the faint scent of the same ancient earth, the same whispering pines. It was a constant reminder of my purpose. The grand design, the intricate tapestry of my reclamation, began to take its final shape. It involved a multi-pronged approach, financial maneuvering to expose Arthur's mismanagement and destabilize his control, legal challenges to invalidate the fraudulent will, and a public relations campaign to discredit him and restore the Blackwood name to its rightful honor. But beyond all the technicalities, it was about a narrative, a story of betrayal and redemption, a story that would captivate the public and turn the tide of opinion squarely in my favor. I had learned the power of narrative, of crafting a compelling truth that could sway hearts and minds. Arthur had stolen my story. Now I would write my own, with him as the unwitting villain. My team, a small, highly skilled group of trusted individuals, each an expert in their field, law, finance, digital forensics, public relations, was assembled with the utmost discretion. They knew me only by my current name and understood the gravity of our mission. They were fiercely loyal, not out of obligation, but because they believed in the justice of my cause, drawn to the quiet conviction that emanated from me. I had chosen them carefully, testing their skills and their moral compass over years, ensuring they were as committed to the truth as they were to victory. We worked in silence, often late into the night, poring over documents, analyzing data, rehearsing scenarios. Every detail was scrutinized, every contingency planned for. We built dossiers, cross-referenced information, and identified every single weakness in Arthur's crumbling empire. The final piece of the puzzle, the most delicate and potentially volatile, was my mother. After I was cast aside, my mother was systematically stripped of everything, not just her social standing, which Arthur meticulously dismantled with calculated rumors and whispers, but her financial security, her home, her very dignity. He ensured she became a pariah, a cautionary tale of what happened to those who dared to defy him, even subtly. She retreated into a quiet, almost reclusive existence, her spirit broken by the relentless onslaught, yet not entirely extinguished. I had watched her from afar for years, a silent guardian, ensuring her basic needs were met through anonymous channels, through proxies who believed they were simply fulfilling a charitable obligation. Her mind, though clouded by a deep, pervasive weariness, remained remarkably sharp, a testament to the woman she once was. Approaching her was the hardest, most emotionally fraught part of the entire endeavor. It was not enough to simply reveal myself, to state my purpose. I understood the depth of the betrayal she had endured, the years of quiet suffering, the erosion of trust. I had to rebuild a foundation that had been shattered by Arthur's machinations and my own forced absence. I started subtly, leaving small, almost imperceptible clues, gestures of care that hinted at someone remembering, someone caring. A rare flower delivered anonymously, a forgotten book mysteriously appearing on her doorstep, a sudden, unexpected improvement in her living conditions that defied explanation. Then, after months of careful preparation, I orchestrated a meeting, not as her son, not initially, but as a benefactor, a concerned individual who had heard of her plight. The pretense allowed her a shield, a way to engage without immediately confronting the raw pain of the past. Gradually, painstakingly, I revealed just enough, piece by piece, the truth of Arthur's betrayal, the intricate web of lies, the true reason for my disappearance. The pain in her eyes when she finally understood was immense, a deep well of sorrow that mirrored my own. But beneath the grief, a flicker of something else ignited. Recognition, and perhaps a yearning for justice. I did not ask her to be a pawn in my game. I asked her to be a witness, to reclaim her voice, to wield the truth that had been silenced for so long. Her role was simple, yet absolutely pivotal. She possessed the original, unadulterated copies of Arthur's early financial records, documents that predated his meteoric rise to power, before he learned to expertly launder and obfuscate his illicit gains. These were the true bedrock of his initial wealth, hidden away for decades, forgotten by him, but cherished by her as a sort of desperate insurance, a hope for a future that never materialized. They detailed the shell corporations, the backroom bribes, the systematic exploitation of smaller businesses, the ruthless acquisition of assets through blackmail and intimidation. More importantly, she held the personal correspondence, the letters, the diary entries that exposed his true character, his callous disregard for human lives, his calculated cruelty. These were not merely pieces of evidence. They were a narrative, a human story of betrayal and avarice that no legal maneuver or PR spin could possibly dismiss. They were the soul of the case, the emotional core that would resonate far beyond any financial ledger. While I was carefully nurturing my mother's resolve, guiding her gently towards the precipice of truth, my team was executing the final stages of our preparation with surgical precision. Our digital forensics experts had created an impregnable vault for the data, a fortress of encrypted information that could withstand any attack Arthur's formidable resources might launch. The public relations specialists, led by a former investigative journalist named Cassandra, had drafted press releases, prepared a staggered information release strategy, and meticulously crafted a public narrative designed for maximum impact and minimal Arthurian counterspin. They understood that the story had to be told in a way that resonated with the public, painting Arthur not just as a criminal, but as a deceitful monster. The legal team, under the steady hand of Marcus, a man whose reputation for ethical rigor was as legendary as his courtroom prowess, had prepared the initial filings, watertight and irrefutable, ready to be unleashed at the precise moment of maximum vulnerability. The day finally arrived, a crisp autumn morning that belied the storm brewing beneath the surface. It began not with a bang, but with a barely perceptible tremor in the financial markets, a series of seemingly unrelated, minor transactions that our finance expert Elias, a man with an uncanny knack for seeing patterns in chaos, orchestrated. Small, strategically placed short sells against obscure subsidiaries of Arthur's sprawling empire, just enough to catch the attention of a few astute analysts, but not enough to trigger a full-blown panic. It was the whisper before the shout, the first ripple in a pond that would soon become a tsunami. Simultaneously, a meticulously crafted anonymous tip, containing a fraction of the damning evidence, was leaked to a mid-tier financial blog known for its independent investigative journalism and its voracious appetite for corporate malfeasance. It was a test, a probe, designed to gauge Arthur's reaction, to see where his defenses were weakest, to pinpoint the first point of failure. The game had truly begun. My mother, seated beside me in the quietude of our hidden command center, watched the screens, her eyes reflecting a quiet determination I had not seen in decades, a flicker of the fire that Arthur had tried so hard to extinguish. The past was about to collide with the present, and Arthur, the unwitting villain, was about to meet his architect of ruin. He had built his kingdom on my family's ashes, and now, from those very ashes, I would dismantle it, brick by painful brick. The blog post went live at precisely 9 a.m. It was innocuous enough on the surface, a speculative piece about unusual trading patterns in a few minor energy holdings linked to a larger, unnamed conglomerate. It hinted at potential insider trading, at inflated asset values, at a network of shell companies that seemed designed more for opacity than legitimate business. No names were mentioned, no direct accusations made, but the breadcrumbs were there for anyone with the inclination to follow. Arthur, ever vigilant against even the smallest threat to his meticulously constructed image, would undoubtedly have his analysts tracking such publications. My team observed the digital currents, monitoring the chatter, waiting for the first sign of his response. Within hours, we saw the predictable reaction. A flurry of activity from Arthur's PR machine, a series of bland, dismissive statements issued through various third-party channels, denying any wrongdoing, attributing the market fluctuations to normal volatility. It was exactly what we had anticipated. He was swatting at a fly, unaware that the fly was merely a scout for a swarm. Our next move was to amplify the whispers. Elias, with his intricate knowledge of market psychology, initiated a series of carefully timed, larger trades designed to exploit the initial nervousness. These were not direct attacks, but rather subtle manipulations that exacerbated the existing volatility, making the initial blog post seem less like speculation and more like prescience. The financial press, sensing a developing story, began to pick up on the unusual market activity. The questions became more pointed, the analysts more inquisitive. Still, Arthur remained secure behind his fortress of wealth and influence, believing he could simply weather the storm as he always had. He would dispatch his lawyers to threaten the blog, his PR team to flood the airwaves with reassuring platitudes. He was reactive, not proactive, a critical flaw we intended to exploit. The real target was not his financial holdings directly, not yet, but his reputation, the carefully cultivated image of an untouchable titan of industry. Cassandra's team began to disseminate carefully curated snippets of information to a wider network of journalists, not just financial reporters, but investigative journalists, with a penchant for social justice stories. These snippets focused not on complex financial jargon, but on the human cost of Arthur's early dealings. They were vague enough to avoid immediate libel suits, yet compelling enough to spark genuine interest. Stories of small businesses ruined, of communities exploited, of individuals whose lives were irrevocably altered by Arthur's ruthless ambition. These were anecdotal, hard to directly link back to him without further evidence, but they began to chip away at the polished facade. The public began to see not just a powerful businessman, but a potentially predatory one. My mother's role in this stage was indirect but profound. The knowledge that her truth was slowly being revealed, that the narrative was shifting, instilled in her a quiet strength. She began to recall details, small anecdotes from decades past, nuances of Arthur's personality and methods that only someone living in his shadow could remember. These insights, though not direct evidence, were invaluable to Cassandra's team, allowing them to craft a more authentic and emotionally resonant narrative. They understood that to truly dismantle Arthur, we needed to turn public opinion against him, to make his very name synonymous with betrayal and corruption. We were building a narrative, a compelling story that would make the eventual reveal of the hard evidence undeniable. The legal team, meanwhile, was preparing a series of civil lawsuits, not against Arthur directly, but against some of his more vulnerable lieutenants and shell corporations. These were strategically chosen targets, individuals and entities that were less protected, easier to penetrate, designed to create cracks in his empire's foundation. The goal was to force discovery, to compel testimony, to open up the carefully sealed vaults of his operations. Each lawsuit, each new article, each market fluctuation was a thread in the intricate tapestry of his downfall, meticulously woven by my team. The pressure began to mount. Arthur's public appearances became less frequent, his statements more terse. We heard through our network of informants that he was becoming agitated, demanding answers, suspecting a coordinated attack but unable to identify the source. He suspected rivals, disgruntled former employees, but never the ghost of his past, the son he had cast aside. The irony was a bitter satisfaction. He was flailing in the dark, fighting phantoms, while the real threat was moving with surgical precision in the light. The first major crack appeared when a mid-level executive implicated in one of the initial civil suits panicked. Faced with the prospect of losing everything, his reputation, his freedom, he began to cooperate with our legal team. He offered not only testimony but access to internal documents, emails, and financial records that directly implicated Arthur in a series of questionable land deals dating back 15 years. This was the first concrete breach, the first tangible evidence that connected the dots between the whispers and the man himself. Marcus and his team worked tirelessly to corroborate the executive's claims, to verify every document, to ensure its admissibility. This was not enough to bring Arthur down, but it was a significant step, moving the narrative from speculation to substantiated accusation. The news of the executive's cooperation leaked, not by us but by a legal clerk in the court system, a small, unpredictable variable in our otherwise controlled environment. The media frenzy intensified. Arthur's stock holdings took a noticeable dip, and for the first time, his board of directors began to ask pointed questions. The carefully cultivated loyalty, built on fear and financial incentive, began to fray at the edges. He was no longer untouchable, merely powerful. And power, when its foundations are eroded, can crumble with astonishing speed. My mother watched the news reports with a quiet, almost serene expression. The weariness was still there, etched into the lines around her eyes, but beneath it, a renewed sense of purpose had taken root. She saw the beginning of the end, the long-delayed reckoning. I knew then that her participation, her willingness to bear witness would be